Next, one of the most significant stories dominating the headlines this week has been the fallout from the editing scandal at the BBC, the resignations of two of its bosses and the questions of trust it's brought out into the open. President Trump's response to it is perhaps more pressing concern for the corporation, as he's threatened to sue the BBC for $1 billion. He's also called for a full apology by today. Well, an apology came overnight in the form of a letter from the BBC board, a sorry for the, quote, error of judgment. It states, too, 5 reasons why it believes there is no case to answer regarding compensation, including the offending Panorama programme wasn't broadcast in the US and was only available to Ukraine viewers, that it's caused the president no harm, as he was re-elected shortly after anyway, and that the 12-second clip was never meant to be considered in isolation, but part of an hour-long programme with plenty of Trump-supporting voices. There are political voices in the UK, including the leader of Lib Dems, Ed Davey, calling on Sir Keir Starmer to step in to tell President Trump to drop his demand. The British Prime Minister responded by stating that he supports an independent BBC, but it must get its house in order, while it has to be said trying to get his own house in order this week amid escalating rumours of a leadership challenge fuelled by leaked briefings within Number 10 itself that accused the Health Minister, Wes Streeting, of plotting a political coup. Headline writers having a hoot this week, likening it to the TV series Traitors. Well, to get a better insight and understanding of both of these issues and more besides, let's cross to London. Let's welcome Dame Emily Thornberry, Labour MP, former barrister, former Shadow Attorney General, former Shadow Foreign Secretary, and who now serves as Chair of the UK's Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Evening, Dame Emily. Welcome to France 24, and thank you for speaking to me tonight. Well, let's start with given your position, given the daily scrutiny on foreign affairs it entails, more often than not it's linked to President Trump. Tell me about the ramifications of this BBC editing error in your view, the trust issues it raises and how significant this controversy is and what lies ultimately at the heart of it.
We have to begin by acknowledging that the BBC, with all respect, is the most trusted news outlet in the world. And that's really important at a time when there is such disinformation, when there is deliberate manipulation of lies from all sorts of sources around the world, and people are desperate to find out what the truth is. And so the BBC is very important, and it's quite self-conscious about its importance. It does know that it has this importance, and it's also very self-critical, and it does make mistakes. It's run by people. It's not perfect. And I think that sometimes the BBC board takes too long to make decisions. There are times when I think that we have outstanding journalists working for the BBC. The BBC's reputation doesn't come from nowhere. It does come from the work of journalists. And there are times when mistakes are made, and there are times when the management doesn't seem to be of the same quality as the other employees who are putting out the content. Now, that it doesn't mean that they shouldn't have. I mean, it wasn't the BBC. It was an independent outlet that made this programme about Donald Trump and his speech and edited the 2 clips together. It's not like he didn't say both bits. But they shouldn't have run it together to make it seem like it was just one part of the speech running straight into the next. There was a good few minutes in between, and it was important to get the context right. But I think that's the point. It's important to get the context right.
Be rigorous, and I guess that affects every public broadcaster. When you talk about yes, the BBC is a leviathan of an organisation. It was a separate organisation putting this together, but yet it wasn't a TikTok feed. This was Panorama. This was a flagship documentary programme. When a mistake is that egregious to that error, it certainly has reason and cause for the panic, the concern that we've seen. And these 2 resignations, again, it's whether there's some complaints. We'll get to that in a moment about whether to an extent the BBC has been captured, whether there's a coup, this optimistic politicising, perhaps from Trump et al. As well. How do you see Keir Starmer, Sir Keir, playing this with President Trump? We're listening to Ed Davey saying you need to step in. You need to say this is British business. This is not for you.
At the moment, the view of the Prime Minister, and we heard from the from one of his ministers today, who has responsibility for oversight of the BBC. And her view, and I believe it's the view of the government, is that the BBC can defend itself as things currently stand. Let's see what happens. It should be listened to. It has made an apology. It is in itself, let's face it, an important source of news within the United States, and growing so, as people are desperate for the truth and desperate to find out exactly what is going on, and as other news outlets seem to be becoming intimidated, and perhaps are not being as critical or as telling the whole story in the way that they should do.
You hit upon something very interesting, which is sort of impacts reputation on a world scale, public broadcasting, the BBC, the trust, the mass media that podcasters, people like Joe Rogan, the most listened to podcast in the world, point to, constantly berated. Now, this is his take on the scandal. I reference it given the size and scale of his audience. He says this, the BBC, quote, "It seems like these people, this is just my opinion," he says, "felt justified in completely lying. This is the BBC, the height of journalistic integrity." And I say this because even if the podcaster, as an alternative to, and often outside of mainstream media, as they put it, regardless of the criticism, listening to that, to what he said, there's an acknowledgement that the BBC is or has been this cornerstone of trust, whether you're a podcaster or whichever sphere that you're in. And that carries with it a ripple effect.
Yeah, and we're in a world where outrage gets round the world really quickly, as do lies, before the truth has even got its trainers on. I mean, this is the world of social media. This is the world of podcasts. But there is another side to this, which is, if you look at the growth of the world service, the largest growth, the fastest growth at the moment is areas around China, and it's youngsters looking at the BBC's TikTok accounts, desperate to find out exactly what is going on. And there is an increasing trend whereby people want to have explainers. They want to understand, go to a source that will tell me what is going on, what is the why is Taiwan important to China? Tell me the history of it, tell me in a way that I can believe and tells me the full story, for example.
If we look at obviously it's not the only problem this week to come out of this scandal. This what appears to be a damning internal dossier of the alleged BBC bias on issues of trans-identity and Gaza war, which was leaked in the Telegraph. The ex-BBC advisor, the Times journalist Michael Prescott, identifying pro-Hamas, anti-Israel slant. Most significantly, it says in BBC Arabic, one-sided selection 2 on trans issues. He urges intervention from the BBC board, which gets to the point, Emily. It's governance and oversight body made up of some political appointees, including a man called Robbie Gibb, Theresa May's former advisor. Do you think there are problems, first of all, with a deep and pervasive bias at the BBC, suggested by Michael Prescott?
I mean, I know of a lot of people who complain very strongly that when it comes to the Middle East conflict, that the BBC is very prejudiced in favour of Israel. I know many people who think that it's prejudiced in favour of Palestine. I know many people who think that the BBC is too, quote, pro-trans, and others who think that the BBC isn't sufficiently sympathetic. I mean, it's kind of what happens if you do try and tread a middle path quite often, and if you're doing it well, both sides are likely to attack you. I mean, this is life. As for a former Conservative spin doctor being on the board of the BBC, I think that it may be one of the problems that we have.
Also, alongside that, Emily, the talk of allegations of opportunism by right-wing politicians, opportunism condemning the mainstream media. I mentioned Joe Rogan. It's not to say he's jumping on this moment, but he's making his point clear. But also Trump's staff, including the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt this week, for example, tweeting the BBC is dying, she said, because they're anti-Trump fake news. This is the spokesperson for the White House, President Trump. Everybody should watch GB News, she says. Your thoughts on what direction the BBC should go in now to re-establish trust?
I think it is really important for the BBC to remember just what a great organisation it is. I think it needs to retain its confidence. I appreciate that it is under attack, and the newspapers that you've been quoting, the British ones, for a French audience may not know, they are themselves have quite a strong reputation as quite conservative newspapers, and it wouldn't be the sort of criticism that you would get from the left-wing newspapers. So, and those newspapers have had campaigns against the BBC for as long as I can remember. I think that it is important that we keep our bulwark of truth and reliability, which is the BBC, that is paid for publicly, that doesn't have a side, that does try to tread a careful path in a world where there is disinformation, where there are lies, where there are attempts to manipulate. And we need to make sure that we hold on to the sources of truth and reliability, and the BBC is most definitely one of those, and it is our duty to defend it, and I certainly am proud to do so.
It's out of the frying pan, Emily, for the BBC, into the fire for Keir Starmer and the leaks from his team this week. A traitor in the midst they let slip. Who is plotting a leadership challenge? Well, it turns out they were briefing against Wes Streeting, the apparent Brutus to Starmer's Caesar. Wes Streeting says there is a toxic culture inside Number 10. What's going on?
What's going on? I mean, I really don't know. You get so many briefings and counter briefings. I do think that these boys, and they're usually boys, I mean, they're only boys, there's these boys in their blue suits, and they all brief against one another, and I think that they should just get on with governing the country. We've been given a great opportunity, a fantastic chance, a gift by the British public, and the British public do expect us to deliver and not to spend all our time bickering, frankly. I think they should all grow up.
Which takes us to your work as Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Dame Emily, must be one of the most unpredictable jobs in Parliament. In terms of your daily workload, what does an average day look like for you? Is there one?
No, there's no average day. It is extraordinary. Day last week, I saw the woman who we think that in truth got elected as president of Belarus, but now has to live in exile. She stood for election because her husband was in jail. She stood and we think won the election, but is now in Latvia, I think, in exile. I saw her. I saw the Ukrainian foreign minister. I had supper in the Egyptian embassy with some members of the Arab League. So you have to kind of jump from one subject to another quite fast. But it's the most challenging and interesting job. But yes, the world has never been a more complicated or difficult place, and my job is to try to make the world, the Foreign Office, as good as it possibly can be by holding it to account. And we need to have a British Foreign Office, as we need to have the French state, treading a careful path and being a force for good.
Can we talk about some of those complications, some of those big issues right now, and Britain's role as well? First, in the Middle East this week, the latest reports about an obstacle, perhaps not. Trump's peace plan is the fact that there appears to be up to 200 Hamas fighters in tunnels in Rafah on the Israeli side of the so-called Yellow Line. There seems to be some ferocious kind of diplomacy around what to do with them. What do you want to see happen here?
Personally, I think that they should leave. I think that there should be somewhere for them to go to. I have some suggestions that I'll speak about offline, but I think there are countries that would accept them, and they should go because they have no future in Gaza. But we can't just allow a vacuum to be left behind. Somebody has to be responsible for the security of the civilians in Gaza, and until that happens, the Hamas will fill the vacuum. That's the problem. So no long-term future for Hamas. We need to have some form of security forces there with some legitimacy, and so that we can move from that to creating the beginnings of a Palestinian state, which is what the long-term aim is of the international community and the people of Palestine.
And from Gaza to Israel this week, Emily, the request in writing from President Trump to the Israeli president asking to give a full pardon to Benjamin Netanyahu over this long-running corruption case. Cigars, champagne, he says, who the hell cares about that? Do you care about that?
I don't think that we should interfere in the court processes of the judicial processes of other countries. I really don't. I think that it's up to, and the justice system in Israel is independent of political interference, and it should remain so.
Also, let's move, because these are issues, as you say, you look at every day. The ongoing conflicts in Ukraine, any lack of clearly diplomatic resolution now, it seems, is in sight, because the Trump-Putin summit that was talked about for so long seems to be no longer a thing. The Russians talking about how, quote, it's not a priority right now. I've heard you say one thing that could change Putin's mind, the kind of will he, won't he, yes but no but, which is basically doing something about the frozen state assets, mostly in banks in Brussels.
Absolutely. I mean, look, the Russians are responsible for they invaded their neighbor with no excuse. They just thought, we want that, we'll take it, and moved in. That is completely unacceptable. And they are killing hundreds of thousands. And they must stop. The Ukrainians have said that they will accept an unconditional peace ceasefire. Let's just stop, and then once there is some calm, we can talk about what the future looks like. That's what the Ukrainians have said, but the Russians won't even accept that. They want to have conditions. They want to have more land before they stop. This is unacceptable. So one way of focusing Putin's mind is to say, right, we have state assets that you have kept across the world, and they have been frozen, and now we seize them. And now they are no longer yours, and we will spend them in Ukraine, rebuilding the infrastructure in Ukraine that you have decimated, and supporting the Ukrainian defense system, which they need to have, because you're attacking their country. Mm-hmm. And that is a very large amount of money. But quite frankly, it's a drop in the ocean compared to the amount of money the Russians are likely to owe the Ukrainians for all the damage they've done to their nation.
I know that Brussels, that the Prime Minister there has talked about a concern of legal action, but I think you've said as well that where there are means, there are ways of doing it in accordance with international law, or putting forward justifications.
I think so. Yeah, I think there's certainly an argument between lawyers on it, but I don't think that it is not. There is a legal justification. There is a legal case for this, and I think that we should just. And in the end, I think what decides it is politics, and so we should be bold and brave about this. The Ukrainians need us. They're fighting a war on our behalf. If they lose this war, what will Putin do next? Putin won't stop. And indeed, I believe that there is two wars going on. There is a war which is the war in Ukraine, but there is also a war of disinformation, which is happening across Europe, but particularly in Eastern Europe. And it flares up when there are elections where the Russians meddle. And they attempt again, bringing us back to what we talked about first. They attempt to spread lies and disinformation, and they try to affect elections, and they try to capture people's minds. And that is a new form of warfare which is being waged on social media, and through cyber attacks and all sorts of other things. That we know is going on across Europe as we speak.
Which takes us back exactly to the BBC, to the fact that Russia will be jumping to joy with this when there is a moment to take advantage of. If a solid story comes out to say, they were found wrong on this particular story. One other story, we get a lot of texts, social media updates, emails, letters about the frustration of what seems to be, in the words of Volker Turk as well today, on Sudan, this kind of stain on the international reputation of an inability to stop what has been foreseen. And we talk about the Sudan conflict, what's going on in El Fasher. Now, interesting, somebody I'm sure, which is Martin Griffiths, the former UN Under-Secretary General on Humanitarian Affairs. He said this week. He wants to see RSF, the Rapid Support Force, designated as a terrorist group accountable for their atrocities, and went on to say, he said, this shouldn't happen, though, until after a ceasefire. And that therefore speaks of the complication of trying to act.
Yes. I mean, in the end, you don't get accountability whilst a war is going on. You only get accountability afterwards. If you look at what happened in the former Yugoslavia, in fact, in the end, a lot of people were brought to trial, people who no one thought would be held to account. But once the war had happened, once it had stopped, and once regimes fell, then they had no longer the protection that they'd had before, and actually you begin to see the truth comes out and people are prepared to come forward and explain what happened during that war, and people then have to be held to account. We cannot allow people to believe that they can behave with impunity, whoever they are and wherever they come from and whatever war it is. There needs to be accountability, and we need to be supporting international law.
Dame Emily, you're one of the longest serving and most experienced politicians within the Labour Party. Why are you not in government right now?
As the Prime Minister.
I mean, you've said it is your ambition to take a seat in government. You want to serve. This is not for lack of disinterest, is it?
I'd love to be. I think when you're in politics, what you want to do is you want to be able to do things. I mean, I do things in the current job that I have in terms of holding the government to account and making sure that it behaves and does the right things. I hope that I am and my committee are creative. We make suggestions, we hold to account, we criticise when we need to. It's just really just sort of making sure that the Foreign Office is as good as it can be. And at a time like this, it is really important the Foreign Office is as good as it can be. So I know the job I do is important, but I would like to be in government itself. Of course I would. I've never had the opportunity of doing that, and it would be great to have that opportunity. But, it's a matter for the Prime Minister, so hey.
Could there be a seat in a West Street in government?
Could there be a West Street in government? I mean, I suspect what we have is we have a very the government is in a very difficult position. We got elected when we had the highest debt that our country's ever had, the highest taxes that our country's ever had, and public services on their knees. And it is really challenging. And I think people elected a government of the soft left and thought, well, they will fix things. And we're held to a very high standard. And we've been in power for a year and people look around and go, well, it's not fixed yet. What's the matter with the Labour government? They don't necessarily expect that from other governments, but they do expect it from us. And there's no point in complaining about it. They've given us a fantastic opportunity. What we now need to do is make sure that we are focused entirely on delivering and not fighting amongst ourselves. And we should get behind the Prime Minister and not it's such a waste of time and energy to spend our time fighting amongst ourselves. The public are not impressed. We should be focused on the job at hand.
Really good to talk to you tonight, Dame Emily. A pleasure to get your understanding, your context on world events and inside Downing Street and on the BBC. Thank you for your time. Dame Emily Thornberry, thank you. The UK Labour MP, Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Stay with us here on France 24. Coming up in 10 minutes' time, The World This Week, 4 distinguished correspondents giving their view on the events of the past 7 days.